Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back after the winter break. Before we go on to new material, I'll do a short review of what was covered over the previous semester, do we call it? I feel like I'm back in college again. The basic structure that I use for this book in the Buddha's words and also for this course is to organize the Buddha's teachings according to three levels, or three layers. And these three layers are determined or defined by the three types of benefits to which the Buddha's teaching is directed. The first level is a level of the teachings that are directed to fulfill what I call the well-being and happiness pertaining to the present life, to the here and now. And these are teachings of the Buddha that are primarily concerned with establishing well-being and happiness at the level of, you can say, ordinary human interactions, with establishing wholesome relationships within the family, with establishing the basic right ethical attitudes in relations between human beings, in establishing social harmony, and also with laying down some guidelines for establishing a political order based upon ethical ideals. And this aspect of the Buddha's teachings were dealt with in chapter 4. And here we have teachings dealing with how parents should bring up their children, how children should relate to their parents, relationships between husbands and wives, right livelihood, and then teachings concerned with eliminating conflicts and disputes, promoting cordial relationships, the Buddha's critique of the caste system, and a kind of political ideal which is represented by the figure of what is called the wheel-turning monarch, that is the king who takes the principle of righteousness as the guiding ideal of his rule, of his administration. The second level of teaching is what I call the teachings that are concerned with the way to a fortunate rebirth. And when we approach this level of teaching, we begin with some investigation of the principles or law of karma and its fruits. And so we started by investigating the Buddha's teachings on karma and his teachings on the way our volitional actions, our karmic actions, produce fruits or results that accord with the ethical action, with the ethical nature of the actions themselves. Okay, and then from the law of karma, we went into a special aspect of the functioning of karma, which is called merit. Merit is wholesome karma, virtuous karma, considered from the standpoint of its capacity to produce a fortunate rebirth and pleasant results within the cycle of birth and death. And then the Buddha categorizes merit or classifies merit into three basic types, which are giving or generosity, moral discipline, the observance of precepts, and meditation, the development of the mind. And of particular relevance to the creation of merit is the development of loving kindness, what's called metta, which the Buddha calls the most powerful of all mundane bases of merit. Okay, the third layer of teaching within the early discourses of the Buddha is what I call the teachings that are directed to the ultimate good, the highest good. In Pali, this is called paramatta. Yeah, the word paramatta takes on a somewhat different meaning for those of you who might be familiar with the Abhidhamma, in the context of the Abhidhamma, and then later in the philosophy of Nagarjuna, the word paramatta takes on a different nuance, a different kind of meaning. But in the early discourses, the word paramatta means quite literally parama, which means supreme, plus atta, good or goal. So these are teachings that are directed to the supreme or ultimate good. And these are the teachings we can call, well, in Pali that are called lokuttara, which means world-transcending teachings. The teachings that lead to the transcendence of mundane life, of worldly life. And in contrast, we can speak of the other two levels of teaching, the teachings concerned with well-being here and now, and the teachings concerned with the pleasant rebirth as being lokiya, which means worldly or mundane. Both words are based on the word loka. Loka means world. And so lokiya means that which pertains to the world. And then the opposite of that, lokuttara, means that which pertains to the emergence from the world, the arising out of the world, or the transcendence of the world. Some translators, including myself, used to use the expression supramundane, but maybe it's a little obscure, especially for people who don't have Latin as their native language. But I think world transcending is more literal, and I think it's clearer. Okay, within this book, the teachings concerned with the ultimate good, the world transcending teachings, will actually properly begin with chapter 7. But chapter 6, which precedes it, I call this a transitional chapter, a chapter that's concerned with constructing the transition from the mundane teachings to the supermundane teachings. Oops, there I go, slipping back into Latin. Teachings that are concerned with constructing the transition from the worldly teachings or mundane teachings to the world-transcending teachings. Okay, the ultimate good, according to the early Buddhist teachings, is nibbana, or in Sanskrit, nirvana. And this means the attainment not of any fortunate type of rebirth, but rather the release or liberation from the whole series of rebirths, which is called samsara. According to early Buddhism, beyond, outside this round of birth and death, there is a state, a reality, a sphere which is unconditioned, which does not depend on any causes and conditions. And this state is what is called nibbana. On the one hand, it's transcendent in that it's, by its own nature, it is beyond all worldly or conditioned phenomena. On the other hand, it's fully accessible to us in this life. It's a state that can be realized, lived in, and experienced here and now. And the early teachings of the Buddha use different ways to characterize nibbana. Sometimes nibbana is characterized in terms of ordinary human experience as a state of supreme happiness, perfect peace, complete freedom, liberation. Sometimes it's characterized as the complete eradication or elimination of those forces that keep us in bondage to the round of birth and death, in bondage to samsara. So from this angle, nibbana is characterized as, for example, the destruction of craving, the elimination of greed, hatred, and delusion, the uprooting of pride, the overcoming of ignorance. And then from still another angle, nirvana is characterized simply by the negation of certain universal characteristics of samsara, or of things within samsara. So everything within samsara, within the round of birth and death, is conditioned, that is, depends on causes and conditions. Nibbana is called unconditioned, not made by different causes coming together. Everything within samsara, all mundane phenomena, arise, come into being. They're born. So nibbana is called the unborn or the unproduced. Everything within the round of birth and death, within samsara, passes away, undergoes destruction. So nibbana is called the indestructible. And then when this is phrased in a somewhat more human way, it's called the deathless, that state which is not subject to death. Okay, it is within this basic framework of conditioned reality and the unconditioned, or this contrast between samsara as the round of birth and death, and nirvana as the transcendence of birth and death, that the Four Noble Truths acquire their full and proper meaning. The Four Noble Truths, so they have a psychological dimension, and so they can be understood at one level psychologically, but at a deeper and more complete level of understanding, the Four Noble Truths are not just a psychological analysis of human suffering, but they rather constitute what I would call a program for world transcending liberation. And so we have the Four Noble Truths. Can't remember what they are. Anybody remember?
The truth of suffering.
Yeah.
The cause of suffering.
The what?
The cause of suffering.
Okay, yeah.
All that is caused, all that arises in suffering. And it's the plan for it, which is the Eightfold.
But what is the third?
Pardon?
I didn't catch the third.
And the liberation from suffering. And the fourth is the plan for that, which is the Eightfold Noble Path.
Okay. But the third is usually stated a little bit differently, not exactly as liberation from suffering.
All that is caused can be stopped. We'll see.
Not the way it's expressed.
Cessation.
That's okay. That's the cessation of suffering. Okay, so we have the Four Truths. And so the first truth, so it begins by referring to something which is a concrete, very real aspect of psychological experience. But when the Buddha examines this first truth at a deeper level, what he shows basically is that all conditioned existence is not really suffering in the sense of being painful or miserable, but it's suffering in the sense of being conditioned, of being impermanent, conditioned. And so the real meaning of this first noble truth is that all conditioned things are unsatisfactory, not capable of giving final, full, complete, perfect satisfaction. And this first noble truth, in its widest extension, is taken to be a way of characterizing all existence within the cycle of birth and death, within samsara. Then the second noble truth, the cause or origin of suffering, which is said to be what in the usual explanation? Attachment, but usually the word is translated a little different. Yeah. Desire is a little tricky and misleading because it gives people the impression Buddhism rejects all desire, which is not the case. But it's craving. Craving is a kind of blind, self-centered desire. And so at one level, when we look at this second noble truth, it seems to be explaining the psychological cause of experienced suffering. And there is definitely that aspect to the relationship between craving and dukkha, suffering. But when we look at the total of the Buddha's discourses, we see that beneath the psychological mode of explanation, there's another explanation which is being implied or suggested. And this is that craving is the driving force that sustains the continuity of existence from life to life. That craving is the impetus, the force at the base of samsara. Or maybe you can say, using the image of a mill, a turning mill, wheel, that craving is the gasoline that keeps the wheel turning. Or if it's the example of a mill, craving is the stream of water that keeps that wheel turning. And so it's craving that drives living beings on from life to life. Okay, so those first two truths are actually a way of characterizing first the nature of samsaric existence, and then very simply the causal dynamics that underlie the cycle of samsaric existence. And the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering, again at one level it can be understood as freedom from all grief, misery, worry, anxiety, stress. But the third noble truth points to a still deeper dimension, which is that of nibbana, nirvana, the unconditioned, as that state which is completely free from all suffering, all experienced suffering, and free from birth, change, aging, and death. And then the fourth noble truth, the truth of the path, explains and discloses the causal process that leads to the attainment of nibbana, the path of practice that leads to liberation from the cycle of birth and death. So one could say, using this dichotomy of Lokiya and Lokuttara, mundane and world transcending, the first two truths are the two truths of mundane, worldly reality. And the third and fourth truths are the truths of world transcending liberation. Okay, and so the ultimate purpose of the Buddha in discovering the Dhamma and in teaching the Dhamma is to lead people to the attainment of this world transcending liberation, nibbana, nirvana. And when we pick up an introductory book on Buddhism, usually we find the book will begin maybe a few pages, a chapter on the life of the Buddha. Then that will be followed, second chapter will introduce the Four Noble Truths. That is the fundamental teaching of Buddhism. But if one looks at the discourses, the original records of the Buddha's teachings, one sees that the Buddha doesn't begin by teaching the Four Noble Truths to relative newcomers to the Dhamma. But he has a standard way of teaching which is designed to prepare the listeners for grasping and understanding the Four Noble Truths. And so the Buddha, when people come to him who have not been previously acquainted with his teaching, he starts by trying to inspire in them faith, trust, confidence, through extolling wholesome qualities and a wholesome way of life. So he begins by first teaching the practice of giving or generosity. He'll speak in various ways of the blessings, the benefits of giving, of being generous, helping others with gifts. Then he'll go on to speak about sila, the benefits of morality, of leading an ethical life, especially avoiding infliction of harm on others, and behaving in ways that accord with the good standards of society. and ways that are governed especially by this principle of harmlessness, non-violence, showing concern for others just as one would for oneself. Then on the basis of the teachings on giving and moral discipline, the Buddha speaks about the worlds that lie beyond our present range of vision. He'll speak about the heavenly realms and how good actions, wholesome actions, can lead to rebirth in the heavenly realms. And then he'll give some description of the bliss, the long lifespans, the peacefulness of these heavenly realms. But the Buddha's aim is not to lead his disciples to a rebirth in heaven as the final destination. But this gradual method of teaching is intended to direct the minds of the listeners to the recognition that there are realms, dimensions of reality beyond what one can see and with one's eyes and touch with one's hands. And the existence of these realms, or let us say the possibility of rebirth into these realms, comes about through observing the principles of good conduct that the Buddha has taught in the early part of this discourse. Okay, once the Buddha reaches the heavenly realms, if he sees that the minds of his listeners are able to understand his deeper message, then he speaks about what is called the drawback in sensual pleasures, the shortcomings, the drawbacks, the defects in sensual pleasures, and the benefits of renunciation. And then when he sees that the mind of the person who is listening has become confident, trustful, open, accessible, then and only then does the Buddha teach the Four Noble Truths. And when he does this, then the usual result is that the listener, at least some members of the audience, will gain a direct insight into the Four Noble Truths. And so the Buddha recognized, even from an early time, that to teach people this world-transcending Dhamma, this Dhamma that goes beyond the conditioned world, is something very difficult. And yet the Buddha found that it's possible. We see this if we turn to the first selection in this chapter. This is called Four Wonderful Things. And this discourse comes after another discourse in which the Buddha speaks about four wonderful and marvelous things. The Pali Acharya Abhuta Dhamma means, usually it suggests something of a miraculous nature. And the first four miraculous things the Buddha speaks about are miracles or wonders that take place on his conception, when he's conceived in the mother's womb. A great wondrous light appears in the world. Then when he takes birth, a great wondrous light appears in the world. When he attains enlightenment, this great splendid light appears in the world. And when he begins teaching the Dhamma the first time, this great wonderful light appears in the world. So those are four wonders, four marvels, but those are the types of things that you could say that ordinary people look to as marks of the miraculous. But then in this other discourse, the Buddha goes on to mention four things that he considers to be the real wonders, the real miracles. The first is that people, for the most part, take delight in attachment and rejoice in attachment. But when the Buddha teaches the Dhamma for the purpose of non-attachment, then people want to listen to it, they lend an ear and they try to understand it. The second is that people, for the most part, take delight in conceit. People like to imagine that they are better than others for this reason or that reason. And yet the Buddha teaches the Dhamma for the purpose of abolishing all conceit. Not only conceit based on class status, wealth, beauty, and so on, but even the subtlest conceit of all, which is what? Yeah, it's the conceit, called the conceit I am. Okay, the third miracle or wonder. People, for the most part, delight in restlessness or in excitement. So we can see when there's a rock concert, many people go. When there's boxing match, wrestling match, seats are sold out weeks in advance. Football game, people go. Dance hall, people go. But when the Buddha teaches the Dhamma for the purpose of quietness, quietude, peace, quiescence, then people want to listen and try to understand. And then the fourth wonder is that people are for the most part blinded by ignorance. But when the Buddha teaches for the purpose of knowledge, wisdom, the overcoming of ignorance, again people want to listen and try to understand. Okay, now, in order to prepare people for understanding this world-transcending teaching, this teaching on the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha uses three standpoints for understanding anything within the world, especially anything to which we become attached, anything that gives us pleasure and enjoyment. And so these three standpoints provide a kind of method, I call it a method for reappraising the values by which we live, the values by which we order and organize our lives. We could also call these three standpoints, they unfold in a particular sequence, a particular order. And so we can call them three steps or moments, using the word moment in somewhat of a Hegelian sense, the way the philosopher Hegel uses the word. Three steps, three stages in the development of understanding. So when we are going to understand the nature of our experience, the way our minds function, we use these three standpoints, taking them in the sequence, the order that the Buddha lays them out. And what are these three standpoints, these three steps? Okay, the first is, we use the Pali word asada, which I've translated or actually I followed Venerable Nyanamoli in translating this as gratification. It might also be rendered as enjoyment. I think it literally means something like the sweet taste, the enjoyable flavor. I think the Chinese translators used wei for it, is that correct? Which has the meaning of taste, right? Flavor. Okay, and what is this sweet flavor, this gratification, this enjoyment? We find this we're on page 192 of the book. What is the gratification in the world? What is the danger? What is the escape from the world? Here the Buddha is sitting on the seat somewhere around the Bodhi tree. Before his enlightenment, he's still a bodhisattva trying to find the way to enlightenment, and now he's reflecting. And the thought occurs to him, what is the gratification in the world, in anything in the world? What is the danger? What is the escape from the world? Okay, then it occurred to him that whatever pleasure and joy there is in the world, whatever pleasure and joy arise based on worldly phenomena, worldly indulgences, worldly experiences, this is the gratification, the enjoyment, the sweet flavor of the world. Okay, so when we are first examining our experience, the Buddha makes it clear that we have to get a clear conception of this enjoyment in the world. This is the foundation. It's something that one can't deny, can't devalue, but one has to come to a clear recognition that there is this enjoyment in the world, in worldly experience. But then one has to look deeper, and then one comes to the second standpoint, the second step of understanding. And this is what is called in Pali adinava, which here it's translated danger. It might also be translated, I think more accurately, as maybe inadequacy, defectiveness, or perhaps unsatisfactoriness. And this, the Buddha says, is that the world, or anything within the world that we get enjoyment from, is impermanent, bound up with suffering, and subject to change. And usually, if one examines the way our minds normally function, usually this aspect of adinava is something that we try to conceal from ourselves. We try to push out of the field of our vision. And we do that, why? What is that?
We're not ready to release it.
Not ready to release it. Yeah, that's one aspect. Anything else?
Delusion.
Let us say delusion is what makes us push a recognition of this unsatisfactoriness out of our field of vision. But I have something more specific in mind.
That there is an immediate sweetness in thinking that things can continue on forever.
I think that's another way of phrasing the idea that I had in mind. In order to continue to enjoy, one has to keep the idea of defects, unsatisfactoriness, danger out of one's field of vision. Somebody is a confirmed smoker. If he hears a radio report, TV report on how smoking leads to cancer, heart disease, switches the channel, get some good music on, or a comedy program, right? Because if he allows himself to absorb that information and really reflects on the consequences, then it's very difficult to go on smoking. Okay, so you can say that continued enjoyment depends upon a certain blindness, which is not simply a completely involuntary blindness, but this is almost a deliberate blindness, a deliberate pushing away of disturbing, disquieting information away from our capacity for recognition. Okay, and then the most distinctive defects, the most universal defects of all conditioned phenomena, according to the Buddha, is the fact that they are first impermanent and subject to change, subject to pass away. And if we're enjoying things with the knowledge that they're impermanent, of course one can enjoy them with a certain amount of detachment. But if they're things that we are really fiercely attached to, then we start to recognize their impermanence, then that attachment will start to dissolve and fall away. And that is what we want to avoid, because if the attachment falls away, we don't get to enjoy that 10th or 20th cigarette of the day. It always seems that it's just that next cigarette that one's going to light up that's going to be the one that has the marvelous taste, or that gives the marvelous satisfaction. Okay, now, then what usually happens when, in our everyday life, if we lose a pleasant object or fail to get one that we want, then we go on searching for new sources of pleasure. Always there's this hope that something will fulfill our desires. So the Buddha, through these first two standpoints, is exposing to us the nature of our ordinary experience. And he's asking us to step back from our immediate immersion in this pattern of enjoyment and to examine the psychological process that underlies it. So we have to step back and observe how the mind works, how the mind is continually fascinated or entranced by the prospect of enjoyment, and then how the things that we pursue either fail to give us this real satisfaction and happiness that we expect from them, or lead to actual disappointment when we lose them, when they pass away or depart from us. Okay, and then when we recognize the second step or standpoint, this prepares us for the third standpoint of understanding, which in Pali it's nisarana. Sometimes people wonder, why does that N have a dot under it? In Indian languages, there's a difference between an N with a dot under it and an ordinary N without a dot under it. The ordinary N, like in Adinava, it's pronounced with the teeth against the roof of the mouth, the tongue against the teeth. We call that a dental N. And the N with a dot under it, it's pronounced with the tongue against the roof of the mouth. Big difference. Can you hear Adinava, that N, and Nisarana? Maybe the way I pronounce it, not so clear. But I know some Sinhalese Sri Lankan monks, when they pronounce them, one could hear very distinctly the difference. Okay, anyway, the third step is called Nisarana, which, following earlier translators, I translate as escape, which I'm not completely happy with, because when people hear this, they think, so Buddhism is a philosophy of escapism. But actually this word, Nisarana, doesn't have the particular connotation that the English word escape does. But rather it means, sarana means going, or literally running. Nis means out, running out, going out. You might even translate it release from, or departure from. And even though we use the word escape, but this is not escapism. What's meant by escapism is indulging in something in order to forget one's troubles, to dampen one's mind from recognizing things that are troublesome and disturbing. But what the Buddha seeks to lead us to is a departure from the things that bind us through understanding their true nature. And through these first two steps, we see how craving and attachment draw us into a quest for pleasure that can never achieve full satisfaction. A quest for pleasure that can never achieve finality. And when we recognize this, then we can see that the way out of this vicious pattern lies in dropping our attachment to the things that we are attached to, the things that we are clinging to. And so the Buddha says that what is the escape from the world? The removal and abandoning of desire and lust for the world. This is the escape from the world. And then the Buddha, in the same sutta, he goes on to say that so long as he did not directly know these three aspects, these three standpoints of gratification, danger, and escape, he did not claim to have reached supreme enlightenment, but it was only when he knew these three standpoints fully that he could claim to be fully enlightened. So we can see that this particular pattern or this particular program of gratification, danger, and escape is very fundamental to understanding the Buddha's enlightenment. Okay, then in this sutta number 3, I'm on page 193. It's a very short sutta, but it makes some very important points. Here the Buddha says, if there were no gratification in the world, in other words, that if things in the world didn't give pleasure and enjoyment, then beings, people, would not become infatuated with the world, enamored with the world. But because there is gratification, because the things that we encounter can give us pleasure and enjoyment, then we become infatuated with the world. But then in the next paragraph he says, if there were no danger in the world, if there was not this possibility of dissatisfaction, if there was not this impermanence, unsatisfactoriness of worldly phenomena, then people could not become disenchanted with the world. The illusions that bind them to this compulsive attachment, they would not be able to see through these attachments. But it's precisely because there is this danger, these shortcomings, these defects in the world, the impermanence, suffering, change, that people can become disenchanted with the enjoyments of the world. And if there were no escape from the world, if there was no possibility of eliminating craving and attachment, of eliminating desire and lust for the world, then beings could not escape from the world. But it's because there is this possibility of eliminating, overcoming craving and attachment, that beings can escape from the world, can be released from the world, can achieve liberation. Okay, maybe at this point I'll ask if there are any questions on what I've covered so far. Yes?
Earlier you referred to the three parts of the Bell.
Oh, okay, that's good. Yeah, but maybe for other people, yeah, in the back, especially in the back.
Earlier you referred to giving or generosity, sila and meditation as the three
Yeah,
levels of achievement.
right.
It was interesting because I always think of primary Buddhism, and you seem to put generosity sort of in that slot.
In what?
You put, normally I was thinking that was the place for
Oh, for wisdom. I see.
rather than the Dhamma, it's interesting. Were you basically, mixing that up, or was that?
No. No.
No, I don't mean mixing it up, but I mean, were you replacing it?
No. I'm not replacing anything. What I was doing is explaining or simply just stating the sequence in which the Buddha expounds the Dhamma, or let's say prepares people for understanding the Dhamma. And so he will begin with generosity, morality, moral discipline, and then the workings of karma, the heavens. This is part of the graduated, what's called Anupupika Dhammakata, which means the gradual, step-by-step teaching of the Dhamma, exposition of the Dhamma. And this is something different. Wait, you said generosity. I'm sorry, I think I got this mixed up with something. Generosity, morality, and meditation. Okay. I got that mixed up with the Buddha's way of teaching. Those are called the three bases for meritorious deeds, the three bases of meritorious deeds. Okay, those are the types of deeds that generate wholesome karma that still pertains to samsaric existence, to the round of birth and death. So those are the types of deeds that will generate or create wholesome karma that will lead to good rebirth as a human being or in the heavenly realms. But those in themselves are not the Buddha's path to liberation, even though, of course, they can become contributing factors to that path. And sila, moral discipline, is definitely incorporated within the path. And then meditation of a somewhat different type becomes part of the liberating path. But when we have the path to liberation, that's the world-transcending teaching, which comes in what I call the third level, the third stage of teaching. There we have the different practices are usually organized into the three trainings of the training in moral discipline, the training in samadhi, we call this meditation, and then third, the training in wisdom. So we have to keep these two. I mean, there's some overlap between them, but the teaching on wisdom, the emphasis on wisdom, pertains especially to the paramatta, the world-transcending teaching. It's not so much emphasized within the mundane teaching. Except, of course, if one has wisdom in the sense of understanding the laws of karmic causation, and of course any wisdom will itself become a source of merit and a cause of wholesome karma. But the special function of wisdom is to lead to world transcendence, not to be part of the round of becoming. We have one question here, then you'll come next. Okay, your own?
Yeah, I think maybe I misunderstood what you said in the lecture. I thought you said the three things for the preparation for the mind that Buddha would teach us before he teaches Four Noble Truths. So was that the three things you mentioned? I thought was generosity, sila, and I think you mentioned the escalation for the heavenly realm.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So I thought that was the three that comes after the mindfulness and the respect of the Buddha, the Dharma and Sangha. So I thought that was part of the sixth mindfulness. And maybe I was confused.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
I thought, when I was listening to your lecture, I thought when you mentioned the generosity, the sila, and the heavenly realm,
Yeah.
you were mentioning the fourth, fifth, and sixth of the sixth mindfulness.
Yeah, six recollections.
Six recollections,
Yeah.
and the ways we prepare our mind. But now it seems to me that you were talking about the training, the stages of training. So I'm wondering whether I got confused when I was listening to the lecture.
Okay, I won't say whether you're confused or not, but I'll just clarify the situation. Okay, those three principles that I was speaking about are principles that figure in the way the Buddha will introduce a new audience to his teaching, to the Dhamma. When people come who are relative newcomers, who haven't really been exposed to his teaching before, the Buddha will begin by teaching generosity. Then from there he'll go to morality, to ethics, and then from there to teaching about the heavens and presumably about the working of karmic causation that brings rebirth in the heavens. Okay, so this is Then when the Buddha sees that the person can understand more, then he'll go on to explain the defects, the unsatisfactoriness of sensual pleasures, and the benefits of renunciation. And then when the person's mind becomes confident and trusting, then he teaches the Four Noble Truths. So that's a particular sequence that the Buddha uses in a desana, in a teaching. Maybe if he's giving a 1-hour lecture, he'll proceed through those topics. It is a fact, though, that the first 3 topics, generosity, morality, and the heavens, do become recollections amongst the set of 6 recollections. So they can be used as meditation topics. But the way I was introducing them was not as meditation topics, but as stages that the Buddha passes through in a discourse. Maybe 10 minutes on generosity, 10 minutes on morality, 10 minutes on the heavens. Then when he reaches that point, then he might go on to what's called the danger, the unsatisfactoriness and sensual pleasures, and the benefits and renunciation. Then the Four Noble Truths.
Without meditation.
Not just meditations.
How can the mind be trained?
It's not a discipline in training the mind, except that the people who will be listening will gain this kind of information that will clear up certain, let us say, fundamentals to the Buddha's spiritual life. Then, say, if they want, after hearing this discourse, if they want to do these meditations, then they can do the meditation on generosity, the meditation on morality, the meditation on the heavens. It's actually the third one. It's actually the meditation on the devas, on the deities. Yes.
Yeah, I always sort of a mental sort of when it comes to talking about the unconditioned of the deathless.
Yeah.
And just sort of kind of think about that. Should I think of this in sort of a parallel universe of sort of depths of reality that are embedded in all phenomena that aren't accessible to normal levels of consciousness? or what exactly? Because it seems like there's some chasm existing between the conditioned and the unconditioned. Somehow these two realms get united.
Yeah.
Talk about practices that people can follow on just sort of a more rational level. How can I see the relation to between these two spheres? It seems to me that in the talk about something like a soul and the heavens and the existence of an enduring self. So I think there's a number of thoughts sort of get conflated here.
Yeah. Okay, maybe I will take Nisarana here and escape the question for now. Because I think to be able to understand it somewhat more clearly, we have to go through the teachings on wisdom. There'll be the teachings on the 5 aggregates, the sense bases, dependent origination. Then we'll have a better conceptual framework for dealing with that question. I sort of introduced the subject of the unconditioned now just to show the ultimate object of the Buddha's teaching. But I don't really want to get into it in an attempt to clarify it conceptually at this point.
I have a question about the first sutta in this section and structure.
Yeah.
The 4 wonderful things are attachment, conceit, restlessness, and ignorance.
Yeah.
And the 3 of them seem to correspond to the behavior delusion of the sort of 3 poisons. But restlessness seems to be given sort of prominence there by including it with those other 3. Can you comment on that? Why restlessness should be included?
Yeah, first I would not put identify conceit with hatred. They're quite different.
Okay.
So I don't think we should try to subordinate this scheme to the greed, hatred, and delusion scheme, except that attachment, of course, corresponds with greed, and delusion, ignorance, are basically the same thing. But we don't have to try to assimilate the other two to hatred. They just don't fit.
Yeah. But then, so restlessness and conceit. I guess I'm especially concerned by restlessness with the brother. Obviously, conceit and has to do with my own self. So how does restlessness fit in that dynamic?
I would just say that restlessness is something that, or let us say, maybe in this case, excitement would be a better word, because people usually don't like to be restless, but people like excitement. So let's translate it.
Stimulation with the world.
Yeah. People like excitement. Like when you see somebody who you haven't seen in a long time, they'll ask you, have you been doing anything exciting recently? Or just hanging around the house. This is boring, I want to do something exciting. Let's see, what's sports match, rock concert, dance hall.
On being liberated from the cycle of life and death, I've always had trouble with this one. I mean, being raised in a culture where I never particularly conceived of an afterlife. Now I've learned that yes,
You have many of them, yeah.
and I can't get what's the advantage of being liberated from this cycle, but within the culture that the Dhamma arose in. What's the advantage of there not being a cycle?
I think we'll come to that as we go through the chapter. As we go through the chapter. Okay, maybe I should go on now. Unless if anybody has a real urgent question, then you could ask. But otherwise, I want to proceed. Okay, so now we can go on to the next text, which is a sutta that comes in the middle-length discourses, Majjhima Nikaya. It's sutta number 13. It's called Mahadukkha Kanda Sutta, the Great Mass of Suffering. But I've retitled it Properly Appraising Objects of Attachment. Okay, it begins with a kind of scene that we occasionally meet with in the sutras, where some monks have gotten ready to go on alms round. They go into the town, in this case the city. They're somewhat early. People have not yet prepared food. And so they go over to one of the parks which are reserved for wandering ascetics. And so they meet some ascetics who are following a different spiritual teaching. And these ascetics say that they hear that the Buddha, what they call the ascetic Gautama, speaks about the full understanding of sensual pleasures. And then they say, we also do so. The ascetic Gautama speaks about the full understanding of form. We also speak about this. And the ascetic Gautama also speaks about the full understanding of feelings. And we also speak about this. So what is the difference between your teacher's teaching and our teaching? Okay, the monks don't feel qualified to answer this, and so they just say that we'll find out the answer later from the Buddha. Then they get up, they go on alms round, and then after they collect their food, they come back to the Buddhist monastery. And then they report to the Buddha what has happened. And then the Buddha says to them that these wanderers from the other sects should be questioned. What is the gratification? What is the danger? What is the escape in the case of sensual pleasures? Again, what is the gratification, danger, and escape in the case of form? This is bodily form. What is the gratification, danger, and escape in the case of feelings? So we have three domains, you could say domains of attachment. Sensual pleasures, form, and feelings. And each of these is to be examined. I call these domains of attachment or objects of attachment. And each of these is to be examined, explored from these three angles. And this will give, when we explore them from these three angles, this gives what I call a new appraisement of them, a new evaluation of them. The Buddha then goes on to say that if these other wanderers are questioned about this matter, then they will get into difficulties. They will not be able to give a satisfactory answer. Okay, now he comes into the first domain, first subject matter, is the gratification in the case of sensual pleasures. Or rather, the first domain is sensual pleasures, and the first way of approaching it, the first standpoint, is that of the gratification, the enjoyment in it. So, what is the enjoyment in the case of sensual pleasures? First, what is meant by sensual pleasures, or sensual objects? They are the 5 sense objects which are considered desirable, enjoyable, agreeable, likable, which are connected with sensual desire and provocative of lust. That is visible forms, sounds, smells, tastes, and tactile sensations. And then those are called the 5 chords, or 5, maybe more simply the 5 objects of sensual pleasure. But then the feelings of pleasure, the sensations of pleasure, and feelings of joy that arise based on these 5 sensually enjoyable objects. That is what is called the gratification in sensual pleasures. Okay, now the Buddha speaks about the danger in the case of sensual pleasures. Disadvantage, the defect in the case of sensual pleasures. And he takes the case of what's called a clansman, called a young man who's getting up every morning, putting on his suit and tie, getting out to drive on the highway, or get on a crowded bus, a crowded train, sometimes to go to the office to work, either could be an accountant, lawyer, factory worker, in government service. Sometimes the weather is very cold. This is India, where North India, actually it gets pretty cold in North India during the winter, but imagine what goes on when he has to go out in January or February in Maine or Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota. He has to face cold and heat. Then he gets attacked by gadflies, mosquitoes, wind, sun, creeping things, usually means snakes, then he risks death by hunger and thirst. Maybe we don't think of this as such a real problem that we face, but even today in countries in the developing world, this can be a serious problem that people face earning their livings. Maybe in today's world, people working risky machinery without proper supervision, without proper training. Okay, so now this, the Buddha says, this is one danger, one disadvantage or defect in the case of sensual pleasures. It's a mass of suffering visible in this present life, caused, rooted in, based on sensual pleasures. I call this, for simplicity's sake, the suffering of pursuit in order to be able to earn enough money to buy objects of sensual pleasure or to attract. For a man to be able to attract a woman as a companion, he has to have a certain wealth. To set up a family, he needs a certain amount of wealth. And so he has to earn a living in this fight. And this involves a pursuit. So this is the suffering of pursuit. Okay, then this young man works very hard at his profession. The Buddha says he strives and makes an effort, but he fails to earn the wealth that he wanted to get. And so no property comes to him. Then he sorrows, grieves, and laments. He weeps, beating his breast, and he becomes mentally upset, crying out, "My work is in vain, my effort has been futile." Okay, this is what I would call very succinctly the suffering of failure. One fails to achieve one's objectives. Okay, suppose he does acquire wealth, and then he can acquire the property that he wants. So property comes to him while he works and strives. Then he experiences pain and misery in protecting the property. And this would have been a very real problem in ancient times, and still is, where there's not a sound legal system involved for protecting one's wealth. So he has to worry, afflicted with anxiety and distress. How can I prevent kings from taking away my property? Kings will say, you have to pay so much as tax. And there would not be insurance, so he has to be constantly worried, how can I prevent thieves from taking off with it? Common occurrence in India in that time. How can I prevent fire from burning my house, my land? How can I prevent floods from coming and sweeping everything away? A common occurrence in India where there would be a torrential rainy season, the monsoon season. Well, we don't have to even speak about ancient India, but people living in Southern California, every year, they call these desert fires, wilderness fires. So many people with $1 million homes in the hundreds and thousands of dollars. Fire comes, a desert fire, sweeping through the whole area, burning up their homes, their precious homes. Then people who are, well, we think of perhaps the most poignant example, New Orleans, but throughout the country when there's a lot of heavy rain, people's homes can be just washed away and destroyed. And then the other danger is, again, this is still very much with us, unloved heirs manipulating the will, going to lawyers and making a case, oh, he intended those property to come to me, or even while he's still alive, manipulating with the legal system to get the property transferred to themselves. And so they make off with it. And so this, I call this the suffering of protection. Once one gets what one wants, one always has to protect it and safeguard it. And besides this, in case of human relationships, especially love relationships, the man wins the woman he loves, the woman wins the man that she loves. Then, after some time, maybe 6 months, a year, whatever, then, I saw her talking to that man. Oh. At the party, I saw my husband spending an inordinate amount of time with that woman. How can I prevent anything from developing? And so there's, again, this protection in human relationships. Okay, so now even though this young man, he's protecting and safeguarding his property, but still, in those days there was no law generally that can protect one's wealth from the king. The king decides he has to get so much as revenue, so he'll say, you have to give me that land of yours, or you have to pay so much in taxes. What thieves make off with it, fire burns it, water sweeps it away, or those unloved heirs manipulate the contract and take the property for themselves. And so then there comes sorrow, grief, lamenting, and again he's beating his breast and crying out, I no longer have what belonged to me. So this is what I call the suffering of loss. Okay, and then again, still with sensual pleasures as the cause, kings quarrel with kings. Maybe we no longer have kings, but country fights with country. And then here are the different groups in the Indian society, Kshatriyas with Kshatriyas, Brahmins with Brahmins, householders with householders. And even within the family, mother quarrels with son, son with mother, son with father, father with son, brother with brother, brother with sister, sister with brother, friend with friend. Okay, so then the quarrels gain momentum, and then they are attacking each other with fists, clods, sticks, or knives. And very sadly today we have to add with guns. And then they incur death or deadly suffering. So here we have the suffering of conflict and violence. And then the suffering of violence, of conflict, is elaborated in paragraphs 12 and 13, where we come into full-scale war. In paragraph 14, we have somebody obsessed by desire for sensual pleasures. They will break the law, rob, steal, ambush highways, seduce the wives of others. Then they're caught, and then the kings have many kinds of torture inflicted on them. In those days, of course, there were no laws against these very harsh punishments. And so often they will, through these punishments, even for just simple acts of burglary, they might have their hands cut off or even be killed. And so this is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures. And these are dangers, the Buddha is always saying, a mass of suffering visible in this present life. But then paragraph 15, he speaks about how people motivated by the desire for sensual pleasures indulge in wrong conduct of body, speech, and mind. And as a result of that, on the breakup of the body after death, they are reborn in what's called the state of misery, a bad destination in one of the lower realms of existence, even in the lowest realm, in hell. And then this is called a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, a massive suffering, not of this present life, but in the life to come. Again caused by the craving for sensual pleasures. Okay, so all of these are different ways of elaborating the danger in sensual pleasures. Then in paragraph 3, we come to what is called the escape from sensual pleasures. And the escape from sensual pleasures is the removal of desire and lust, the abandoning of desire and lust for sensual pleasures. Okay, then the Buddha adds an important paragraph. He says, those ascetics and Brahmins who do not understand as it really is, the gratification is gratification. So one has to understand the enjoyment that comes from sensual pleasures. And those who do not understand the danger, the unsatisfactoriness as a danger, and who do not understand the escape, the release from sensual pleasures as escape. It is impossible that they can either fully understand sensual pleasures themselves or teach others, guide others, so that they can fully understand sensual pleasures. But those who understand all these things, the Buddha says, they can fully understand sensual pleasures themselves and instruct others so that they can fully understand sensual pleasures. That is possible. And so the sutta originally arose over this problem that had been posed by the wanderers of other sects. Who fully understands sensual pleasures? That was one of the problems. And the Buddha is here saying that essential to full understanding of sensual pleasures is understanding the gratification, the danger, the escape. Okay, the second domain of what I call understanding, or the second domain of attachment, is form. In a way, this seems almost to be closely related to sensual pleasures, but I guess what is meant here is the bodily form itself rather than the appearance of the form. Okay, so the Buddha now takes an example. He says, suppose there were a girl of the Khattiya class or the Brahmin class or of householder stock in her 15th or 16th year, neither too tall nor too short, neither too thin nor too fat, neither too dark nor too fair. Is her beauty and loveliness then at its height? We have to remember that probably many of the Buddha's disciples here are monks who are 21, 22, 23 years old. Like you ask me, a monk in his 60s, 15, 16 years old, that's just a little girl. I remember there was a case, somebody told me that there was a Burmese meditation master, U Pandita, who was giving a course to Americans, and he was going to lecture in the meditation course on the sutta. And his American pupils told him that this isn't like a traditional Asian country where one always speaks just from the masculine point of view. You have to balance that by also speaking from the other side. And so he said, for the men, suppose there's a girl who's 15 or 16 years old, and for the women, suppose there's a boy who's 15 or 16 years old. And afterwards, a woman told him, for us, the 15-year-old, 16-year-old boy is just a kid. Venerable, get real. They didn't put it that way. But anyway, first, for those of you women who might think that this passage is being one-sided, first remember the Buddha is speaking to monks, so naturally he's going to take the example of a young girl. And then at the time, many of the Buddha's disciples would have been in their 20s, early 30s. And also the marrying age at that period was much younger. Here, maybe people in their 20s, even later, get married. But in the Buddha's time in India, at that time, 15 or 16, that's the proper marrying age. You know, if a woman is 18 years old and she's not married, then it's almost like a hopeless case for her. Okay, so this is the gratification in the case of form. That the pleasure and joy that arise from contemplating this woman at the height of her beauty and loveliness. And what is the danger in the case of form? Later on, one might see that same woman at 80, 90, or 100 years of age, then descriptions of her bent over, supported by a walking stick, her youth gone, the teeth are broken, the hair is gray or scanty or even completely fallen out, skin is wrinkled, the limbs blotchy. So then her beauty and loveliness has vanished, and the danger, the adinava, has now become evident. So this is a danger in the case of form. So that is illustrating now old age. Then the next one illustrates the characteristic of disease. One sees the woman who is now gravely ill. She might be lying in her own urine and excrement. Some people have to lift her up, others have to put her down. So again, the beauty and loveliness has vanished and the danger has become evident. Then one might see that same woman as a corpse, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days dead, and so on. Again, the beauty and loveliness have vanished. Then it takes the corpse through different stages of disintegration. It just occurred to me to understand the danger in form. It's not really necessary to consider another person, but one considers one's own body, this body itself. Maybe when one is 15, 16 years old, 20, 21, 40, 45. One thinks, now I'm young, strong, healthy, vigorous, in the height of my powers. But then one has to contemplate that if I live that long, this body will become 80, 90, or 100 years of age, bent over. The same body becomes ill. One becomes helpless. And then this body dies and undergoes disintegration. And so all of this is bringing out the danger in one's own body. Okay, and so then what is the escape in the case of form? Again, the removal of desire and lust, the abandoning of desire and lust for form, we say for the body. And again, we have this paragraph on what constitutes full understanding, but this time in the case of form rather than sensual pleasures. Okay, the third domain of attachment is feeling. Feeling here doesn't mean what we call emotions, but it's feeling simply in the sense of the felt quality of experience as being pleasant, painful, or neither pleasant nor painful. Okay, and now the Buddhist takes first the gratification in the case of feelings. He's going to take the case of the most pleasant, mundane feelings possible. And he takes the case of a monk who passes through, who first enters into the first jhana. This is the first stage of meditative absorption, where the mind becomes separated from its involvement in sensory phenomena, becomes inwardly focused and absorbed. And in that state, there's still some degree of thought taking place, but there's great rapture or bliss and happiness and pleasure. And so, in that case, in that state of jhana, one doesn't act in any way for one's own affliction or for the affliction of others, but one is experiencing only that feeling which is free from any affliction. It's a state of unadulterated rapture and bliss. But that's not yet the highest feeling in these levels of meditation. For one can go beyond that through the stilling of the subtle residue of thought. Then one enters the second jhana. And then rapture, which has some flavor of excitement to it, subsides. And one enters into the third jhana, the state of pure bliss. And then one passes beyond the third jhana into the fourth jhana, a state which is free from pleasure and pain, the state of balanced equanimity, in which the feeling is very refined, very subtle, peaceful. And so the Buddha says that this feeling without any affliction, this is the highest gratification, the highest enjoyment in the case of feelings. But still, even these feelings of the meditative absorptions, of the jhanas, these deep meditative states, these feelings too are impermanent, suffering and subject to change. And so if one becomes attached to those feelings, then one exposes oneself to suffering. So that is the danger in those feelings. And then the escape from feelings, the Buddha says, is the removal of desire and lust, the abandoning of desire and lust for feelings. That is the escape in the case of feelings. Okay, and so those ascetics and Brahmins who do not understand the gratification, danger, and escape in the case of feelings, they cannot fully understand it themselves or teach others how to fully understand it. But those who understand these, they can fully understand feelings themselves and teach others how to fully understand them. Okay, I think we'll call it a stop at this point. Then I'll ask whether there's any questions. Any questions based on what has been covered so far? Okay, let's take sort of hands coming up from the back.
Just talking about sensual pleasure brings to mind the five aggregates. Will we be getting into that at all?
Into the five aggregates.
Yeah.
Eventually we have a whole section on the five aggregates, but that will come later.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, it comes in the course of when we get into the discussion, into the treatment of wisdom, then we take the five aggregates.
I think form in the second domain, attachment can only refer to what's on the body. If it also refers to the it also refers to forms in the eye of the beholders, then how could you distinguish it from the first chord of sensual pleasure in the first domain of attachment?
That's why I find it rather difficult. I said I find it rather difficult to separate them. But I think I have to say it's a little bit mixed up in the sutta, because it seems if the Buddha is taking the example of a beautiful form of a young woman for a man, it seems almost that its visible form is a source of pleasure. Whereas if one wants to take the body isolated from any admixture with essentially attractive form, then one should take one's own body rather than the body of another. Is that your point? It seems so to me, too. Though I don't, that's just what I have to say. Yes.
The part about feeling, I'm a little bit surprised what you said, that maybe I misunderstood it again. The part about feeling is saying that the greatest gratification came to feeling is freedom from affliction. And in this paragraph, or the few paragraphs under feeling, basically talking about four jhanas.
Right.
We're talking about four jhanas gradually help us reach the freedom from affliction. So is this saying that our attachment to feeling and domains of feeling is associated with jhana? What is the essence of this part? I mean,
Yeah, okay, the way I understand it, the Buddha is not taking the jhanas here as part of the way to freedom from attachment, but rather the jhanas are brought in here in order to show the most refined, the subtlest, the most, let's say, wonderful types of feelings. And then to show that these feelings, okay, one gets a gratification from these feelings, the feelings of the jhana. Like this is something much subtler, more refined, more wondrous than the grosser feelings of pleasure that come from indulging in sensual pleasures. So he's showing first that there is this pleasure and enjoyment that come from the jhanas, that comes within the jhanas, the feelings that are called the feelings associated with non-affliction. But even these feelings are impermanent, subject to change, and if one clings to them, then they become bases for suffering. So the point seems to be that even for those who are leading the meditative, ascetic life, one should not become attached to these feelings of the jhanas.
Those kinds of gratification also have danger and gain from.
Yeah, the danger is that these feelings too are impermanent and subject to change. And so one should not become attached to those feelings. Of course, as part of the Buddha's path, one develops the jhanas, but without attachment to them, through understanding their impermanence. And then by giving up that attachment, then one escapes from bondage to those feelings. Because if one indulges in the enjoyment, the enjoyable feelings of the jhanas, that will lead to a rebirth in some higher realm, what's called the Brahma world. But those realms are impermanent too. I think I have a passage on that coming later in this chapter we'll get to next week.
If one does not go through the jhanas, does that prevent one from going on further in the spiritual walk?
Wait, take the
If
microphone.
one does not go through the jhanas, does that prevent one from going further in the spiritual walk? The jhana is necessary for the spiritual walk.
This is a point which is somewhat debated even amongst Buddhist interpreters, whether the jhanas are absolutely necessary. Let us say that the jhanas themselves are usually used as a definition of samma samadhi, of right concentration. And so the Buddha does place some emphasis on the jhanas. There's a question whether it's possible to reach the development of insight without passing through the jhanas, which is a rather moot question. But we don't have to settle that question in order to understand this passage here. The point of the passage is simply that the pleasant and peaceful feelings of the jhanas can become an object of attachment too. And so by examining their danger or their unsatisfactoriness, one has to put away the attachment to that pleasant feeling or to that tranquil feeling and then become free from them.
It seems to me that when we were talking about form, and you brought it to my personal form, as opposed to what I see out there, that it took my understanding outside of the realm of form's pleasure, but without the form's identification. And so it seemed to me that the trap that he's talking about is also that being identified with my form as I am, which then creates the illusion that this is all that I am.
Yeah. Okay, this is a good point, but what I would say is that that is not the point of the present passage. Of course, the present passage is concerned, let's say the present passage defines the sadha, the enjoyment, as the pleasure and joy that arise from these things. So it's not, this passage itself is not concerned with identification. But there will be other texts which do speak about how this identification, what's called the illusion I am or the conceit I am, like one of the ways to break it, to dissolve it, is through the contemplation of impermanence, and especially the death and disintegration of the body, is one sort of avenue to eliminating that conceit. But that is a good point. Any further questions? Okay, then I think, okay. That means that the lunch is ready. Time for the asada, the sweet things. Someone also has to understand the adinava. Henry is not here this week, but next week I hope to finish the chapter. Then next week, after lunch, then I will conduct the discussion. So if you have questions based on anything within this chapter, then you can write them down, or questions that arise next week. We can discuss them maybe for about a half an hour from 12 to 12:30. Okay, so let us end by sharing the merits. I think Jin Lee, you've given out. Okay. So we share the merits from listening to the Dhamma, speaking the Dhamma with the devas, that's the deities, with the nagas, the so-called dragon spirits, and with all beings, asking them to rejoice in these merits and to achieve all of their good purposes. Akasata Jabhumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Sasanang Akasata Jabhumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Desanam Akasata Jabhumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Mangparang Etavatacha Amhehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Deva Anumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavatacha Amhehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Bhutanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Ekavatacha Amhehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Sata Anumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Bhavagupadaya Vichihetato Etantare Satakai Upapanna Rupya Rupicha Asanya Sanyino Dukha Pamuchantu Pusantu Nibu